everybody. For those that don't know me, I'm Mike Baisdow, and I'm a tree fruit specialist with Cornell's Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. I'm located in the Champlain Valley, and on behalf of the entire team with the Northeast Extension Fruit Consortium, we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. So just some housekeeping before we start. Today's session is going to be on orchard herbicides, materials, timings, and rates. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Thierry Besançon, who is with Rutgers University. Thierry is an extension specialist in weed science for specialty crops and is located at the Philip E. Marucci Center for Blueberry and Cranberry Research and Extension in Chatsworth, New Jersey. And Thierry focuses on specialty crops, both on herbicide and alternative weed management strategies. So we're very much looking forward to his talk today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Thierry.
Thanks, Michael, for the introduction. And it's really my pleasure to be with you today. I apologize again, for missing the meeting 2 weeks ago, but it was a challenging time, and I'm glad that we're able to reschedule it today. So thanks for that, Michael, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. So as Michael mentioned, I'm a weed science specialist, and I'm especially working on specialty crops. So it's many crops. I have many crops in my portfolio, from blueberry, cranberry in New Jersey to veggies, tree fruit, grape, sweet corn. So it's a large portfolio of various crops. But today we'll be focusing on orchard weed management, and we'll be discussing integrated weed management as well as different herbicide tactics on looking at what kind of herbicide can be used for managing weeds in orchards. So really, why do we need to care about weeds? It's really the question. Is it just something aesthetics, or is it really some impact of weeds on fruits production? Definitely, orchard, especially young orchards, are very sensitive to weed competitions. In orchards, you have a lot of open soil, you have a lot of light that can facilitate the development of weeds, much as a crop. So especially in young plantation, you have all this open space can really stimulate the development of the weeds. Weeds, just don't need light to grow, but they also need light to emerge. So especially the weed seed, the seed of annual weed at the surface of the soil, need to get some light to stimulate germination. So when you have this kind of condition, of course, that will you will end up in a situation with many weeds. Tall weeds such as marystail or sometimes foxtail can shade young trees and disrupt harvest. In addition, weeds can also increase the risk of getting disease and pest by keeping either the bush wet. So by getting weeds, you may keep a more wet environment, which may stimulate the development of disease. Weeds can also block spray for fungicide or insect, meaning that you're losing the efficacy of these sprays. And in addition, the last one, especially in young plantations, weeds can offer protection to rodents that in turn can start feeding on the trees by eating the bark of the young trees. So definitely weeds are a problem in orchards, and we need to find ways to manage them. So something that we have been focusing on, not just me, but many weed scientists, in the country over the last few years, is really looking at integrated weed management. So it's really moving from the old conception of just working mostly with herbicide to integrating other components to really improve our weed management. So really, when you're looking at the integrated weed management toolbox, the baseline is really prevention. So before reacting to a situation, we try to prevent this situation to happen. So prevention is really something really important. Later, when we have to take care of the weeds, we'll try to do that by using mechanical, cultural practices, biological not so much, but chemical practices as well. So chemical are integrated among other weed management practices. So that's really important, especially because if you're looking these days, I will have a few slides later discussing that, but if you're looking at the situation these days, we have an increase in the number of weeds that have evolved herbicide resistance, so that cannot be controlled with herbicide that typically we are controlling them a few years ago. We have new weed species. We are talking about climate change, but I mean, weeds are moving also over time. Maybe not so much in tree fruits, but in other cropping system. I mean, these days we're talking a lot about Palmer amaranth, for example. Palmer amaranth was a weed which was native to the southwestern United States. Now you can find it in New York, you can find it in New Jersey, and it's getting a huge problem. On the other reason why we are also focusing so much on integrated weed management is also because there's an increased societal demand for less pesticide, including herbicide. So I will be discussing, what are the different steps of what you should be considering for doing integrated weed management in tree fruit production. So the first step of any integrated weed management program is really know your enemy, know what you're dealing with. So weed identification is really essential for developing a successful management plan. And that's really the first key component of this integrated weed management plan. So the life cycle and growth stage of a weed will largely determine optimum timing of control measures. So for example, if you're looking at an annual weed species, so for example, a foxtail like we have on the left picture, these kind of grasses need to be targeted when they're young and actively growing. Okay, now if you're looking at a perennial species, if you're looking at crabgrass, for example, this one is a perennial grass. On this one, if you really want to get some effective management strategy, the best one is probably to deplete the food reserve in underground vegetative structures, which is not at the same time, that's in terms of timing of control, that will not be happening at the same time as what you will be doing for an annual species. So knowing the difference between species and knowing which group they are belonging to is really critical for proper timing of weed management strategies. So the importance of weed identification, first, I mean, basically not weeds are all created equal, or not all management strategies are effective against all weeds. Even if you're mentioning, the herbicide that is supposed to kill everything, if you're mentioning glyphosate, glyphosate is not active on some weed species. I mean, I have some weed species here in cranberry. We did some work with glyphosate. Actually, glyphosate is not really working well on this type of weed. Weed IDs can help us determine why some species are developing in area. So basically, you can use weeds as a symptomology of some soil condition, such as compaction, such as a wet spot, that will be very beneficial. I mean, this kind of condition will be beneficial to the development of some weed species. So for example, nutsedge really like to develop in wet place. Knotweed prefer to develop in compact soil. So identifying the weeds can provide you clues about other conditions happening in the field. Weed ID can help you to determine how an uncommon species came to the field site. So, for example, if you have maristyle, you know that maristyle is dispersed by the wind. The seed will just fly with the wind. But if you have Palmer amaranth, for example, Palmer it has some small rounded seed. On the kind of the kind of problem with Palmer is that it's moving mostly with equipment. So harvest equipment or any kind of equipment that you have in the field may contribute to introduce Palmer. So if you know what weed you're dealing with, that can give you indication on how the weed managed to move to the field. And definitely, the weed ID can really help you to develop a tailored weed management program based on trajectory response to treatment. So the first big difference when we're on that's something important because that will be part of what we'll be discussing today when we'll be especially discussing herbicide later, is really to know the difference between the grasses, the monocot, for example, such as goosegrass, and the dicot. So that's really a basic knowledge that we need to know because regarding herbicide, that will determine many herbicides that may be effective on grasses may not be effective on dicots, and vice versa. Something which is tricky when we're talking about grasses is separating grasses from other grass-like weeds, if you want. So in this group, I will include the rushes and I will be including the sedges. And many times you will hear me mentioning, that yes, okay, these herbicides may be working well on grasses, On sedges, sometimes maybe looking like grasses, but actually they are not grasses, and they will not react. They will not be controlled by some herbicide that can be effective on grasses. So knowing really what, how to separate rushes and sedges from grasses is really important. If you're looking at a picture of sedges, what I like with sedges is everything is always going by tree. If you're looking at the stem, it has a triangular stem. When it's making, the leaves are disposed in an arrangement of 3 leaves together at the same time. So you can look at that. I mean, the sedge have a triangular stem. The grasses have always a round stem. Now with rushes, if you're looking at rushes, the rushes have a round stem as well, except that inside the stem, it's not hollow. Okay, you have some marrow, if you want, inside the stem, which is typical of rushes. Grasses are really a round on hollow stem. So another thing that is really important to consider too is, the life cycle of these species. So we have some annual weeds, and most of the time, this one are probably the easiest one to control. So annual weeds will complete their life cycle in 1 year, from seed germination through seed formation by the end of the season. On most of the time, I mean, all of them will be spreading by seed dispersion. So species like maristale, goosegrass, or smooth pigweed are all annual weeds. Some of them may be winter annual, maybe meaning that they will be growing at a specific time of the year during the winter. Some of them may be summer annual, but they are all ending, they're all completing their life cycle in one cropping season. The perennial weeds, which are probably the one that we have to deal with in many perennial cropping systems. The perennial weeds will be living for 3 years or more. Usually they can spread by seed, but many of them can also spread vegetatively. So if you're looking at field bindweed, bottom picture, field bindweed can really spread by making these rhizomes that are running underground, and that will lead to the development of new shoots. So these perennial weeds include many woody plants, trees and shrubs as well. So some example of perennial weeds that are problematic not just in tree fruit production, but in many small fruit and other perennial cropping systems like grape. So yellow nutsedge, red sorrel, dandelion, bindweed, all of them, Canada thistle, all of them are considered perennial weeds at some point, and they're always the most difficult weeds to control, mostly because they have these underground storage organs that can really help them to survive over time. So a few weed ID online resource I just posted right here. A few websites where you can find picture on description of different weed species. So really, if you want to really start with the first step, which is to know your enemy, you can consult these websites. I would say that there is also a very nice book, especially for us in the Northeast, that's Weeds of the Northeast. It's still available on the Cornell website. The good news is that you may want to wait a little bit for this guide before buying it, because it's actually revised. So we should get, hopefully, in the next, maybe this year, maybe next year. I don't know exactly what is the timing. We will have to check with Antonio Di Tommaso at Cornell. But there is a revision, version of this guide that is supposed to be published in the near future. So that's still, even the version that we have right now is still valid. The only thing is that we have a few new weeds that have made their way in the Northeast, and that need to be included to the guide. But I would say that the most interesting aspect of weed identification is really looking at applications that you can use on your phone, and that can really help you to really identify some of these weed species. And the good thing is that it's just on your phone, it's in your pocket, you can bring that in the field, you can take picture, and you can identify your weeds directly in the field. So there's 2 different applications. One is called iNaturalist, the other one is called PlantNet. I'm mostly familiar with iNaturalist, and actually in my team, we're using it a lot of time, not just for identifying weeds, but also for posting a picture of nice plant species that we may have here in the Pine Barrens. but it can also be used for weed identification. So both applications are using recognition software and algorithm, if you want, that will compare the pictures that you're taking with your phone to an image galleries, and that will provide you with an identification. Speaking of iNaturalist, it's not something which is just based on automatic recognition, if you want, based using a software, but observations are also validated by people who are really botanists, who have this skill for identifying weeds. So it's not just machine-based. You also have people that will be validating the observation later, because one of the big goals of iNaturalist is really to create this, this database of weed species. Sorry for that. This database of plant species in the Northeast, well, not in the Northeast, but in the United States. Oh. Turn off my phone. My apologies for that. I should have listened to Michael earlier. But really, when you're looking at this application, they will be all working by using unique morphological characteristic of the plants on really something that can really help you to improve your identification of the weed that you try to identify, is really looking at different characteristics. So you want to get plants from the same species with different leaf stage. So young leaves, leaf fully developed. You also want to get some picture of flowers, especially with broadleaf species. That's something that will be really helpful for identification. And that means that usually, that's one of the caveats that we have with this application, is that you have greater chance of good identification with broadleaf species, because you have these flowers that are very characteristic of each species. You have better chance of identification with broadleaves and grassy weeds. The grasses are very small and not obvious flowers, and people are really, struggling. These applications are really struggling with identifying the grasses. Something which is always important, regardless of if it's grass or broadleaf species, you need to make sure that the picture are clear and minimize the background. Take up detailed picture, take up close-up pictures. That's really important for really improving identification of plants with this application. Do not hesitate to submit multiple pictures from the same plant under different angles. That's really important. And I will say that if you may get an identification relatively soon, but when you're posting the picture on the iNaturalist website, a few days later, you may have people validating your identification. So you may want to check what identification you're getting immediately after posting the picture, but you may want to come back a few days later to see if other people have been confirming identification as well. In any case, with this kind of application, always try to double check identification with reputable source. So check with your extension agents, check with weed science specialists in your state, just to make sure that if there is a doubt, that will be important, because identification will determine what kind of strategies you may be using later for controlling the weeds. So detecting the weeds, now you manage to identify the weeds. How do you detect them in the field? That's really something important to consider with regard to integrated weed management. So the first thing we need to consider is that not all weed species are emerging at the same time in the field. Each species has a kind of appropriate timing of emergence. So for example, if you're looking at horseweed, maristale, typically it will start emerging in fall, and it will eventually keep emerging during the winter if you have nice condition. For us in southern New Jersey, it may happen frequently. And it will typically, bloom in spring, and by early summer it should be dying. But you have other species. For example, common lamb's quarter. Common lamb's quarter will only start emerging in spring, usually early spring, April, mid-April is the right time when common lamb's quarter start emerging. But in the same category, in the same summer annual weed, if you want, the ones that are start emerging in spring and that will complete the cycle by the end of the summer, in the same group, you may have, for example, Jimson weed or morning glories or fall panicum that will only start emerging in early summer. So really, I mean, it's important to consider that, yes, during the season, not all weeds are emerging at the same time, meaning that if you really want to tailor weed management to your field, you cannot just count on a single scouting during the season. You need to come back to the field multiple times to really look at these weeds and see when they're actually emerging. So weed emergence, as I mentioned, some of them, I mean, the emergence period will differ by weed species, and the length of emergence will also differ depending on weed species. So for example, common ragweed, it's really concentrated in April and May, and its emergence will last 4 to 5 weeks. But if you're looking at giant foxtail can keep emerging over a period of 4 to 5 months during the season. So clearly, if common ragweed is a problem for you, maybe targeting, you know, a pre-emergence herbicide or residual herbicide early in the season may just be sufficient for covering common ragweed emergence because it's just 4 to 5 weeks. Now, if you have giant foxtail, clearly one single pre-emergence application early season will not be sufficient because it may be lasting 4 to 6 weeks. And after that, you don't have enough herbicide left over in the soil for you know, controlling what will be emerging later in the season. So it's really important to, you know, identify and know some biology of these weed species to really target, you know, the proper timing of emergence. Emergence will be influenced by soil temperature, soil moisture, as well as seed depth and cultivation. My rule of thumb is that when we are scouting for weeds, if we have, you know, if we have condition where we got rain on relatively high temperature, that's really good condition for weed emergence. Relatively soon after this type of condition, I would say 3 to 5 days after we got these conditions, we need to get back to the field to really look at what weeds started emerging because we got optimal conditions. So scouting for weeds, there's a few things that you know you need to keep in mind when you're scouting for weeds and trying to build a weed map of your plantation. Each sample area should represent no more than 5 acres. So that's you know that's a rule for scouting. You need to spread out sampling area for getting a representative map of weed infestation, especially because you may have, you know, I mentioned earlier that weeds will also depend on soil conditions. So if you have areas of the field where you know that you may have water standing, that may be areas where you have one specific type of weed which may be extremely complicated to control that you want to sample because that's where you want to focus in the field. So be mindful of weed clustering area, do not overlook them. Make sure you're including this weed clustering area in your scouting plan. And when you do that, when you're scouting for weeds, please always bring a camera with you so you can get picture. And if you find something that you don't know, but that may be a problem because you have a huge infestation, get this camera ready so you can start identifying as soon as possible. And clearly, the picture the picture on the left side, it's bindweed emerging. And that's really the kind of stage you don't want to wait the weeds to be too tall. This kind of stage where you can still see cotyledons, you have 3 fully emerged leaves. That's the kind of stage we really need to target if you really want to be effective with weed management strategies. So that's for this one. This slide, it's really a map I made basically of critical scouting periods for weed management. Initially, I did it for blueberry because I'm working a lot on high bush blueberry, but you can probably adapt it to other conditions, other crops as well. So basically, we try to have a weed survey prior to applying our spring pre-emergence herbicide. In blueberry, that's what we do in blueberry. Late in the season, in May, we want to get a post-bloom weed survey. We know that start to be the time when some of these pre-emergence herbicide may start to have reduced efficacy because they start to be degraded in the soil. They're not there anymore. If we put any post-emergence herbicide following post-emergence application, usually 1 week after post-emergence herbicide application, we want to have some evaluation to make sure that we didn't miss any spot or eventually that we don't have any problem with potential resistant weeds. We want to do a post-harvest weed survey because usually when you're harvesting, it's not the time when you will be putting herbicide in the field. But when you're harvesting, the weed do not stop growing. The weed will still be there. So you want to make sure that following harvest, the season is not over, certainly not over for the weeds. The weeds keep growing. So you want to get a post-harvest weed survey. On eventually with some growers, depending on the kind of weed infestation, we want to have a weed survey prior to a fall pre-emergence application. So in blueberries, the way we are scouting, we do 2 to 3 stops per acre. Each stop, we are walking along a 30-feet distance, and we are looking at what kind of weeds are present. What we are recording, we try to keep it simple. We are looking at weed ID. We are just looking at growth stage, trying to estimate how tall are the weeds. We are looking at the number of plants, and we are not counting. I mean, we don't have time for that. We are just looking at, is it something which seems to be a low infestation, medium, or high infestation? So it's really, there is no counting associated with that. On the last one, very important too, is looking at crop phenology, because if you plan to use some herbicide, it's not just effective on the weeds, but you want to make sure that the crop phenology at this time will allow you to use some herbicide without, on minimize potential injury from herbicide at the time of application. Start clean, stay clean. That's really something really important to keep in mind, especially in our orchard, because they are perennial crops. Really choosing carefully the site where you plan to plant peaches or apple is really important, especially because you want to avoid perennial weed species. So species like bangleweed, canal thistle, goldenrod, you want to avoid this kind of site. And if you have this kind of site, if you have this kind of weeds already present in a site where you plan to plant an orchard, you need to have an aggressive management before planting, because when the orchard is established, your option will be extremely limited for controlling these perennial weeds. So that's really critical to do. So there's different strategies that you may want to consider. One strategy that take times, but may be efficient with some weed species, some perennial weed species, is really to continuously deplete underground nutrients reserve. So you really want to force these perennial weeds to use whatever is stored in the rhizome without giving them time to replenish by making leaf, by growing. They will not be able to send back nutrients back to the roots. So cultivation can really exhaust stored energy and may also expose underground structure, so they can get desiccated. So that's under some specific condition. Clearly, if you have rain coming in the next few days after cultivating, that may not be working so well, because that will keep the environment wet, and some of these perennials can reroot really easily. So basically, if you want to try this kind of approach, you really need to cultivate every 7 to 14 days to really be successful at controlling perennial weed with cultivation. If you don't do it on a regular schedule, if you really have this infrequent disturbance, you can have roots and rhizome fragments that will spread throughout the field and become reestablished. Basically, by not doing it on a consistent schedule, you will give an opportunity for a piece of rhizome to reestablish themselves in the field. The other option with many of these perennials is really to use a systemic herbicide. There's not many systemic herbicides that we can really use in treefold production. One of them is glyphosate. I would see that glyphosate is working on many grasses, on broadleaf perennial species. 2,4-D may also be an option. So when you see, so it was starting clean, so you need to start clean. I mentioned that staying clean was also important, and we need to realize that when we are moving equipment, we are moving many times a lot of weeds in and out of production environment. So clearly, you can look at these brush mower that are covered with dandelion seed. That's a perfect source of reinfestation for weeds. So cleaning equipment, make sure that you're not, if you're working in a clean environment, if you're working in a clean orchard, make sure that you're not introducing weeds that are not initially thoroughly. So Carolina redwood, that's a picture on the right. That's another way that weeds can get into the field. Carolina redwood, it's a typical weed of cranberry here in New Jersey, and we are using a cranberry leaf as a mulch in blueberry. You can clearly see on the first picture, you can see Carolina redwood growing in blueberry, and it has been introduced with cranberry mulch. So that's important to keep in mind, that when you're using mulch, make sure you're using something that has been sterilized, that's something which is clean of weed seed, because that's a source of weed infestation. That can be a source of weed infestation as well. Preventing weeds from dispersing and becoming established is critical. Already something which is very important is preventing weeds to really start dispersing the seed, because all the weeds can produce seeds, and the seeds can contribute to the seed bank. You may have 1 year of seed production, and you will end up with maybe 7-10 years of weed production, because some of these seeds are not just emerging the next year. Some of these seeds may be dormant for a couple of years, and they may emerge at any time later in the future. So clearly source weed-free mulch or compost natural mulches. If you're using cover crop, make sure you're using cover crops that are free of weed seed. Really, it's not just managing the weeds in the field, but also managing weeds on the borders of the field is important, especially with seeds that can fly. So on this one, we have some Asteraceae, maybe dandelion. It's actually dandelion seeds. This one can fly over a long distance, on trying to make sure that at least in the very close neighborhood environment of the plantation, making sure that you don't have seeds coming from this environment is really critical. So mowing the field borders, keeping the field borders clean from not from weed, but at least from seed production is really important. Suppressing weed physically. So once you identify them, when you scout for weeds, how do you suppress them physically? There is different method. One is really looking at mechanical owing. If you really want to get to be successful at controlling the weeds, you need to cultivate pretty much every 3 weeks for effective control of many weed species, at least annual weed species. It works really great on annual broadleaf species. Does not work so well on grasses. It doesn't work very well at all with perennial weed species, mostly because you still have all these, rhizome underground from which new weeds can emerge. That can help. This kind of mechanical owing can help reduce vole and rodent problem. The problem, and I've seen that when I was in Europe, is that when you're using this equipment, especially with some crop species, you can really damage the fine feeder roots that are at the surface of the soil. So it will take time for the orchard to really, to get used to get these equipment. So maybe for a couple of years, you will see a decrease in production before it starts stabilizing and maybe increasing, because the roots need to get deeper to avoid to be destroyed by mechanical owing. Physical disturbance can also dry and degrade the soil and organic matter of the soil. I mentioned it before, but perennial weeds may not be well controlled because they can grow back from underground rhizome. Something to consider too is that with some weed species, and I was thinking specifically to Canada thistle, for example, if you're breaking small pieces of rhizome of Canada thistle with mechanical equipment, and if you're dragging that over a distance, you can allow weeds to reestablish itself in a different spot. So actually, instead of controlling some of these perennial weeds, because you're breaking the rhizome in smaller fragments, you can allow the plant to reestablish a new population later. So instead of controlling, you will be spreading the weeds. Organic raw mulch, that's really something that is used relatively a lot here in New Jersey, at least in blueberry, not so much in tree fruit, but in blueberry it's used a lot. It really helps with preventing the emergence of annual weed species as long as you have a sufficiently thick layer of mulch. So you need at least 5 to 10 inches of mulch to really get some effective, maybe not 10, but at least 5 inches of mulch to really get some efficient weed suppression. It can really help with moisture retention and prevention of soil erosion. Over time, using mulch, especially here in New Jersey in our sandy soil, may increase organic matter content. Now, one of the big issues that we have with these organic mulch is that they are mostly carbon. And when bacteria will start degrading the mulch, basically they need to get a source of nitrogen to degrade the mulch. And the way they will be finding the nitrogen is to use whatever nitrogen you want to provide for the crop. So in this kind of situation, you need to be thinking that you need to compensate for what the bacteria will be using for degrading the mulch. So you need to increase your rate of nitrogen to make sure you're compensating for what will be used by bacteria. It may be costly. One of the problems that we may have with this type of mulch too is that it can harbor weed seed, pests, and potentially harmful disease. Fabric mulch. So fabric mulch can really help with moisture retention. They can help with soil warming. They can really prevent some weed emergence. And now one of the issues is that they can be expensive to purchase, to place in the field and to dispose of, especially with plastics. So we have people that may have issues with the production and disposal of plastic in the environment, especially because of the effect of microplastics that can fragment over time and contaminate and pollute environment. In addition, especially with plastic, not so much with fabric, but with plastic, some weed species, for example, yellow nutsedge. Yellow nutsedge has no issue passing through the plastic mulch. So that's this one. Actually, the mulching may just stimulate the development of the yellow nutsedge because it will warm up. I mean, the soil will be warmer, and there will be no competition from other weed species because all other weed species will be controlled because they cannot grow through the mulch. But since the yellow nutsedge can grow through the mulch, you will end up relatively quickly with a situation where you may just have a uniform yellow nutsedge colonization of the field. I just wanted to show you something that my predecessor here at Rutgers did a few years ago, looking at combining herbicide and physical weed control in new plantings. So he looked at herbicide. It was either untreated or he had a residual and post-emergence herbicide application with Prowl, Gallery, and Gramoxone. And he combined that with physical weed control, either no-till, tilled monthly. He used a leaf mulch or he used a landscape fabric. Is what you observed. So clearly, where you don't have no herbicide, no till, you can see that these peach trees that are barely, just maybe 2 years old on these trees, clearly, I mean, you can see the effect of weed competition clearly suppressing the development, the growth of the trees. If you're looking at no herbicide but just tilling, that's also not very efficient for stimulating the development of the trees. Now, if you're looking at no herbicide on leaf mulch, clearly you have weed suppression. And in addition, if you're looking at growth of the trees, these trees looks great. I mean, actually, they produce a lot of biomass, healthy green coloration of the leaf. So these trees looks good. So you can get good growth without using herbicide. Now, if you're looking at using a residual herbicide on no-till, if you're just looking at the residual herbicide, that will not be sufficient during the season for controlling all the weed species. So clearly, you need to use this residual herbicide if you plan to use herbicide, but you need to have other options during the season for controlling the weeds because it will not last throughout the season. If you're looking at tillage, residual herbicide on tillage, same kind of situation, the trees are looking a little bit better. Again, if you're looking at residual herbicide associated with leaf mulch or fabric, these trees are really looking the best in this experimentation. If we're looking at trunk diameter, clearly in the no-till or till situation, clearly using an herbicide is really preventing. It's really stimulates the development of the tree, or at least not. You will have less weed competition, so the tree trunk diameter will be bigger. Now, if you're looking at leaf mulch on fabric, we don't have so much of a difference in trunk diameter between untreated and herbicide treated. So is there a need for herbicide in this kind of situation? Probably not. Now, if you're looking at production, clearly, where we used herbicide and we had no till or either a till situation, we had clearly significantly higher fruit production. Where we had leaf mulch, similar situation, where increased fruit production as well. But if you're looking at leaf mulch on fabric without herbicide, we had also clearly greater fruit production compared to untreated no-till or till situation. So clearly the leaf mulch on landscape fabric suppress or control the weeds, so that can be really useful. But if you're looking at increase at the tree growth on early yield production with leaf mulch on landscape fabric, it's not just because of the herbicide effect. One advantage of this leaf mulch on fabric is that they can really warm up the soil. They can prevent, they can provide greater humidity. I mean, you will have less evaporation of the soil. And all these conditions can really help with increasing tree growth on providing higher yield as well. So let's discuss some of the herbicides that we have available for tree fruit production. We have, I don't know for the Northeast, I know that here at Rogers we have a tree fruit management guide, which is, I put the email, the website address. You can find it on the website. I will urge you to be careful if you do that, because herbicide may not be labeled for use in your state. And I will give you some example when we'll be discussing some specific herbicide. So if you plan to use this guide, make sure that you're always checking either on CDMS or Agrian website. Two rates are based on soil type and content. So depending on your soil type and organic matter content, the herbicide, the rate of residual herbicide will change. Post-emergence herbicide rates will depend on weed species, on weed growth stage. And that's specifically specified on the label, so that's critical. On the pre-harvest interval is also something that you can find in this production guide. That is also important. That will, of course, change depending on the type of herbicide. So I will start with, since we are mentioning that, I will start with some general note on residual pre-emergence herbicide. So this type of herbicide will remain active in the soil for weeks or months. Some of them may be very long, and that will depend on many environmental and soil factors. So you have to remember that not all herbicides are equally safe on all crops or on both bearing and non-bearing plants. So some herbicide may be labeled for apple, but may not be labeled for stone fruits, or some herbicide within apple may be labeled for bearing trees, but not for non-bearing trees. With this herbicide, very important, we said it before, but starting clean is really important. These herbicides need to get into the ground. If you have vegetation staying at the surface of the soil, it will basically make a screen between the herbicide spray and the soil, and these herbicides will not go where they're supposed to be active. I really consider, I mean, some of them may, it depends on the herbicide, but with most residual herbicide, spring application need to be made before bud break. You need to make sure that you're adjusting the rate to soil type and organic matter content. With this kind of herbicide, you cannot have a gap in the soil without any herbicide. So really getting a uniform spray coverage is really critical. So you really need to, at the beginning of the season, before putting this herbicide, you need to do a good job at calibrating your spray equipment. On something that we try to, we are sometimes overlooking is that activation is required. What do I mean by activation? These herbicides are spread at the surface of the soil. If you let them at the surface of the soil, they can be, for some of them, relatively quickly degraded by UV light, for example, or washed off by the rain. So you need to get rain. You need to get at least half an inch of rainfall or irrigation within 7 to 10 days to get this herbicide moving into the soil. On some time, with some of them may just be effective on broadleaf species, some of them mostly on grasses. So you need to consider plant mixes. You cannot just rely on a single herbicide for controlling everything. So with many of these herbicides, you will have to consider making, some tank mixes for really broadening the spectrum of weed control. So I separated, I just give for apple and peaches, just indicative. It's not an exhaustive list, if you want, of some of the residual herbicides that we are using. So we are using herbicide in the WSA group 3, Prowl, which is labeled for apple and peaches, new plantings on established orchard. Princep and Carmex are both labeled on peach and are labeled on peach for new planting on established orchard. Simba is labeled for everything. Solicam is the same. Zeus, I was looking at Zeus because we have a label for Zeus here in New Jersey, but when I check the CDMS website, Zeus is not labeled in New York and Massachusetts. So it's only labeled for use on apple, and it's not labeled for use in New York and Massachusetts. Goal and Chateau are in the same category as Zeus. They are mostly broadleaf herbicide with some grass activity. One characteristic of these Goal, Chateau, eventually Zeus as well, is that they also have some post-emergence activity. So you're using the pre-emergence herbicide, but at the same time, it can control some weeds that have started emerging. Motif is a relatively new, not new herbicide, but it's a new label. It's actually Mesotrione, which is labeled on peaches for new planting on established orchards. Cazeron, it's an old chemistry, residual herbicide that can only be applied in the winter, and there is good reason for that. It can easily volatilize. So it's something that is mostly to target for fall or midwinter application. Allianz, I will be discussing Allianz a little bit later. It has a label on established peaches. Trellis on Pindar GT, not so much experience on Pindar GT. Both Trellis and Pindar GT are not labeled for use on New York. Trellis, actually, it's known as Gallery, except Gallery was only labeled for new plantings. Now Trellis SC is also labeled for established orchard, at least on apple, not on peaches. So some of these herbicides, I will look at the WSSA group 2, what we're calling the Microtubulin Mediator. So we have pendimethalin and pronomide in this group. They are soil-applied herbicides. They really don't have post-emergence activity. So they're really good for pre-emergence control of annual grasses, as well as some small broadleaf weed species, some small seeded broadleaf weeds. Pronomide curve is also extremely good for control of perennial grasses. So if you're dealing with weeds such as quackgrass, pronomide is a good herbicide for controlling quackgrass. One problem with curve is that it's also very sensitive to volatilization. So it's mostly an herbicide curve that we like to apply in fall to minimize volatilization of this herbicide. So both herbicides are absorbed by roots on shoots of emerging seedlings, but they are not really translocated. So when you see damage, most of the damage will be visible on the root system of the plants. I will not, for the sake of time, I will not discuss exactly the way what they are doing to the plant, but I will just show you some symptoms of herbicide injury with this herbicide. So clearly, I mean, if you're looking at the upper plant of the part, you don't see much damage. Or you will see damage because the root system has been damaged. So really, you will see a lot of stem swelling on stubby roots on many plant species. In strawberry, I took this picture of strawberry, but it's stunted growth on chlorosis. It's mostly the stunting. It's mostly coming not because the herbicide translocated to the top of the plant, but mostly because it causes serious damage to the roots of the plant. Very important, another group which is very important, that's the Photosystem II Inhibitor. So these one are really inhibiting the photosynthesis in the plant, and by doing that, basically they are blocking electron transport in the plant, they are blocking the fixation of carbon dioxide, they are blocking the production of energy by the plant. And in the same time, they're forming, because you have all these energies that cannot be used in the plant, all this energy will be used for forming highly reactive molecule, the reactive oxygen species. On these reactive oxygen species will cause a lot of degradation in the plant by degrading the membrane, the membrane of the cells, of the plant cells. You have mostly 3 different herbicides that are in this category. You have Simazine, Princep, Carmex is Diuron, and you also have Terbacil, which is Simba. All these herbicides are really effective for broadleaf, annual broadleaf species, but not so much for grasses. So when I was mentioning the need for a tank mix partner, that's the kind of herbicide where you want to make sure that you will be mixing this herbicide with a good grass pre-emergence herbicide. So some symptoms of this type of herbicide, when they're acting, when they're working well, you will see a lot of intervennal chlorosis. You may have some marginal necrosis as well. Something which is always interesting to consider is that the older leaves will be the one showing the most damage and will be the first one to show damage. So if you want to check if these herbicides have been effectively controlling some of the weeds, not just look at the new shoots on the weeds, but start looking at the oldest leaves of the weeds. The PPO inhibitor herbicide, so this one are blocking the production of an enzyme in the plant, the protoporphyrogen oxidase, which is producing the PP9. And PP9 is really very important molecule in the plant because it's a precursor for chlorophyll, which is needed for photosynthesis. It's also a precursor for heme, which is needed for electron transfer during the photosynthesis. So similar to what I said before for Photosystem II Inhibitor, this herbicide will cause the production of a lot of reactive oxygen species that will be attacking the plant membrane, the cell membrane of the plant. So you have different herbicides that are in this category. You have Gaulle, you have Chateau, which are pre-emergence residual herbicide. You have AIM. AIM is not a residual herbicide. AIM actually is strictly a post-emergence herbicide. It doesn't have any residual activity. On the last one is Zeus. I didn't mention Zeus very much because it is not widely available in the Northeast. Some injury, some typical injury of PPO inhibitor herbicide. So you have injury from the soil. So injury coming from soil application, from residual application. You will see a lot of chlorosis, some mottled chlorosis, some necrosis on the leaf. You have this kind of water-soaked spot at the surface of the leaf. In some situation, and that will be in the next slide, you will see some drift injury, and that will show the typical shotgun effect of this type of herbicide because they have post-emergence activity. When you spray them, if you don't pay attention, you can cause a lot of injury to the crop as well. So that's what I wanted to show you, and it's coming from a picture, a case I've seen a few years ago in blueberry, and it can happen in any kind of perennial crop as well. It's really drift injury caused by a soil that was treated with fluoxazine, Chateau herbicide. Actually, the grower, drove in the field a few days after application, created a lot of dust that settled down on the leaf. On the next morning with the dew solubilized the herbicide that was attached to the soil particle. And you got all this injury. You have this kind of shotgun effect on the leaf of the plant. And that's something which is very typical with PPO inhibiting herbicide. So wherever you plan to use Chateau herbicide, it can be used on young plants, but you really need to make sure that you're protecting trees, young trees, by using tree guards, wax container, anything that can be a non-porous wrap or guard is really important to consider when you apply fluoxazine, sulfentrazone, or oxyfluorphen, because if you have any soft tissue, these herbicides, either by drift or by physical drift, by getting spray droplet moving onto the plant, but also by dry drift, when the herbicide is attached to the soil particle, can cause a lot of damage to the plants. The bleacher herbicide, that's the one that's Mesotrione, actually, that's Motif. So these one are directly interfering with the production of carotenoids in the plant. So the carotenoids are really there to protect the chlorophyll. So if you don't have this chlorophyll, you will have all this energy absorbed by the plant, by the chlorophyll, destroying the chlorophyll molecule. And that's why these herbicides are turning, are turning the weeds completely white. It's just because you don't have the carotenoids to protect the chlorophyll molecule from excessive energy. The molecule, the chlorophyll molecule, will be destroyed. The leaf will turn completely white. So Motif is really good herbicide for controlling many annual broadleafs, eventually some grasses, but it's essentially a broadleaf herbicide. It will control crabgrass, but for example, it will not control goosegrass at all. So if you plan to use Motif in your field, you need to get a tank mix partner for extended grass control. Something to note as well is that Mesotrione has both residual and post-emergence activity. So if you plan to use Motif for residual control, it may also help you controlling whatever weeds are already emerged in your orchard. Symptom Energy is really typical. I will not spend too much time on that, but it's really this whitening of the new leaves. It's a systemic herbicide, so the herbicide will be moving to the new leaf, and they will turn white. Clearly, it may take some time for the plant to die, but when you have these whitening symptoms, it's a sign that the herbicide has been absorbed by the plant. The older leaf may still be green, but the plant will still die within a couple of weeks. This one is the AASA group 29, that's the inhibition of cellulose synthesis. So these plants are really preventing the synthesis of cell wall, of cellulose. And there's 3 different herbicides that are labeled for tree fruit that are belonging to this group. One is Allianz, we have Cazeron, and we have Trellis. And I will spend a little bit of time discussing Allianz because I was actually in New Jersey, we got a lot of discussion regarding the use of Allianz. Allianz is really is a really great herbicide. Growers like to use it because it has such a long residual activity. But some situation, example right here in grape in California, Allianz in some specific soil can also be damaging to the trees or to the grape. So Allianz, I mentioned it's a very effective residual herbicide for annual grasses and broadleaf weeds. It's not really working on sedges, it's not working on sedges on perennial weeds, but it's really a great herbicide, and people try to use it as much as they can because it's providing easily 5 to 6 months of residual control. However, we do not recommend the use of Allianz as a standalone residual herbicide because basically it's not controlling everything. So you need to get some other herbicide for really improving the spectrum of weeds control with Allianz. Something which is some of the weaknesses of Allianz is that it's not working so well when you already have established annual weed species. So if you have clean ground, yes, Allianz will be a good herbicide. But if you already have a well-established population of weeds, Allianz may not be the greatest herbicide for you. It doesn't work well on perennial grasses and broadleaf weeds. It doesn't work well on sedges. And something which is really tricky with Allianz is that you really need to get a significant rainfall for activation, but you need to get 48 hours at least of dry condition following the application. And there is a good reason for that. Allianz has both high water solubility and it's very strongly absorbed by soil particles. So it can bind up very strongly to soil particles. And you need these 48 hours of dry condition to really give sufficient time to Allianz herbicide, to indaziflam, to be absorbed on soil particle. If you're providing too much water too quickly, you will wash off the herbicide because it will not get sufficient time to be absorbed by soil particle. In addition, since it's it's very strongly absorbed, when it's absorbed by soil particle, since it's very strongly absorbed, you really need to get a lot of water to get it back into solution and to be active at preventing seed germination. So it's a tricky herbicide to use, and that will limit the timing of Allianz application. So really, when we are considering Allianz, we really try to say to growers that the best time to use Allianz is really late fall because you will provide sufficient time for getting sufficient rainfall for activity in the herbicide. So really, if you apply Allianz in spring, you can expect less control when using Allianz in spring. You can tank mix with herbicide if you plan to use it in spring, you can eventually tank mix it with herbicide that can be activated by very little rainfall. If you have perennial weed species, consider controlling them with a systemic herbicide, such as 2,4-D or glyphosate, because Allianz has absolutely no control of perennial weed species. It does not control weeds that are already emerged. In addition, it's not effective on perennial weed species. And if you have nutsedge, yellow nutsedge is not controlled by Allianz, so you really need to keep thinking of using eventually some DIA or Matrix in mid-spring for controlling sedges. Yes, I'm checking the time, but I may have scheduled something a little bit too long, but I will discuss post-emergence herbicide right now. So something to keep in mind with post-emergence herbicide is that you never want to let any non-selective herbicide, such as 2,4-D or glyphosate, or Rely or even bromoxone, getting in contact with green or living tissue. I said blueberry, but it's basically any kind of crop tissue. So really, with this kind of herbicide, using protective shields around the plant will be really important. When you're using post-emergence herbicide, weed size really matters. So weeds are usually best controlled when they're small, I would say 2 to 6 inches in size, and also when they're actively growing. So if you have weeds that are stressed, either drought stress or temperature stress, they will be less sensitive to herbicide treatment. So make sure that if you want to maximize the effect of herbicide on weed control, make sure that your spraying plants that are not under any kind of stress. Post-emergence herbicide may require the use of spray tank additive for maximizing control efficacy. So you may need to use a surfactant such as non-ionic surfactant, crop oil concentrate. So always look at your recommendation or look at the label to determine what is really needed with a spray. So optimal spray volume and appropriate nozzle selection can vary among herbicide, so that's something to consider as well. And be aware of herbicide resistance in some weed species, and especially because herbicide resistance is something that we mostly observed with post-emergence herbicide. Briefly, right now we have a little bit more than 500 unique cases of herbicide resistance, which are affecting 260 species. Just in the United States, we have 123 unique cases of herbicide resistance in the United States. So, how do you, when you're suspecting that you may have something that has not been working, how do you know that you have resistance? First, you need to check if the correct herbicide has been applied at the correct rate and in the correct spray volume with the correct adjuvant at the correct time. So that's a lot of correct, but that's everything you need to do to make really sure that these post-emergence herbicides are working well. Were there any environmental or weather conditions that could affect herbicide performance? So, for example, a good example is looking at Rely herbicide. We know that Rely herbicide need to be applied under sunny condition. So really a good time of application is midday, cloudless condition, sunny condition will be perfect timing for Rely application and for maximizing Rely control. If you do the same kind of application very early in the morning, when you don't have enough light, you may have reduced control because the weeds will not just be able to take up the herbicide. If you suspect resistance, do you have any kind of typical pattern that could suggest that you have a clogged or malfunctioning nozzle or any kind of other application issues? So before saying it's resistance, if patterns may be associated with malfunctioning equipment. Do you have any kind of live plant intermixed with dead plants of the same species or other susceptible species? So that's really important because if you have within the same species, if you have plants that survived on plants that clearly died, you may be on the track of suspecting that resistance may be an issue right here. But you also need to consider that plants of different size, even if they're the same species, will not react the same way to the herbicide. So plants, when there's a seedling stage, may be efficiently killed by post-emergence herbicide, but when they're getting taller, herbicide effectiveness will not be the same, will decrease. Is this a problem that is getting worse over years? Are there any known cases of herbicide resistance nearby? And I know that Lynn from Sosnowski from New York is working on many suspected cases of herbicide resistance. I know that she mentioned to me that there was a suspected case of paraquat resistance with Marestyle, but I don't think that so far she has been able to confirm it. So some of the herbicide that may be used for post-emergence control. So we have what we're calling the graminicide group, WSSC group number 1. So Select, Max, Post herbicide on Fusilade. So some of these herbicides, so all of these herbicides are really good for controlling annual grasses. And for some of them, I think especially of Select Max and Fusilade, both Select Max and Fusilade are also effective on some perennial grass species. Group number 2, we have Sandia. Sandia is only labeled on palm fruit, on apple. Matrix is labeled both on palm fruit and stone fruit. Sandia, it's working great on broadleaf species. What I like with Sandia is that it's our #1 herbicide for sedge control, for post-emergent sedge control. Both Sandia and Matrix have also residual activity. So when you apply them, you're not only controlling what is already emerged, but you may also provide some additional residual control. In group number 2, that's our growth regulator herbicide. So that's where we have 2,4-D, either Embed or Widar 64. So these one are really working great on annual on perennial broadleaf species. We also have Stinger in this group. And Stinger is really great herbicide for leguminous clover on composite. So thistle, goldenrod, horseweed will be controlled by Stinger application. Group 14, we have AIM on Trevix. AIM, I don't have a lot of experience with Trevix, but AIM is really something which will be working, but really if you have small broadleaf seedlings. So anything that is less than 2 inches tall can be controlled with AIM. But if it's starting to get bigger, yes, you will not get a lot of control. On the last one, I mean, are what I'm calling the non-selective post-emergence herbicides. So that's why you have glyphosate. That's why we have Rely. That's why we have Gramoxone. Glyphosate will be working on many annual and perennial weed species, except sedges. Rely is non-selective. It will control many annual weeds, but it will not be controlling goose grass, for example. On Gramoxone, it's a non-selective herbicide, which is really working on small annual weed species. That doesn't work great on sedges. Michael, I think we are getting close to time. So I may want, I mean, I had a few other slides, but I may want to skip and look at my last slide where I was looking at some tips for 2022, because many of the herbicides, I mean, some of these herbicides that we're discussing today may be in short supply for this year. So I wanted to briefly mention something about these herbicides, if it's okay with you.
Yep, I think that's fine by me, Thierry.
I had an in-depth discussion of some of these herbicides. Clearly, it was a little bit too long. So yes, here we go. So Lynn and I, we work together on trying to get information to the growers to prepare for herbicide shortage in 2022. So we already know that for herbicides such as glyphosate or glufosinate and some other some other post-emergence herbicide, we know that we'll have a really short supply this year. So everything that I discussed today will be really critical this year, especially scouting. Regular scouting and proper weed identification will be critical, because that will allow you to use these herbicides actually really when you need them and when you can really optimize control of the weed. Using pre-emergence herbicide will be even more critical this year, because the shortage seems to be targeting many post-emergence herbicide. So really using your pre-emergence residual herbicide the best you can will be really critical, because that may lessen your reliance on post-emergence herbicide. Again, I mean, for post-emergence herbicide application, proper timing and proper rate will be critical. Especially, I mean, the timing of application is important with regard to weed development. So the sooner you can control this weed, the better control you will get and the less herbicide you will need. So for smaller weed, you don't need to use as much glyphosate, for example, to control a small seedling than you will need if the plant was already 10 inches tall. So timing will be critical. Pay attention to adjuvants. Use adjuvants because that can maximize the effectiveness of this post-emergent herbicide. Get perennial weeds under control at the right time, and eventually consider non-chemical weed control strategies when and where appropriate. And it's just a quick overview. The big thing, if you want to get more details on this information, is that Lynn and I, we summarized everything in a note. I know it's on the Cornell blog, so you may have more information on the Cornell blog. We also put it in the Rogers Plant and Pest Advisory. So we just briefly look at some of the tips for 2022 on how to best use this post-emergence herbicide. But if you look at this website, you will have more information on really what is important and what you need to pay attention to this year for maximizing the efficacy of this herbicide.
Jeremy, if there's any questions in the chat box, if you'd like to go ahead and ask those to Thierry now, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. I think we just have one question so far, but we may have a couple more that come in. So the first question, Thierry, is, did you notice vole tunneling under fabric mulch plots at all in your studies?
So I will speak with my European experience because I did that in Europe a long time, 10 years ago. I've seen it under tarp, but the damage were not. We have seen the tunnels, but we didn't see as much damage when we are using a tarp. We didn't see as many vole damage when we are using a tarp compared to mulching with straw or mulching with tree bark. Clearly, with tree bark, I mean the vole can get back to the surface and can start showing on the fresh bark. So yes, we saw tunnel, but the damage caused to the tree, to the young trees, were less with tarp than what we observe with an organic mulch.
Okay, and so you all weren't really making an attempt to control voles in those studies at all, right?
Yes. No, I mean we didn't try to control voles. We observe vole as a consequence, if you want, of the kind of weed management strategies that we are trying to get. One advantage with either mechanical or herbicide control regarding voles is that you have a clear ground. On voles, they really don't like open space because open space means that they can be visible for predators, for hawks or for whatever mammals can eat the voles, and they really don't like to colonize areas where you have open space. So one good reason for really getting, either tarping or cultivation or herbicide in young plantation, it's also decrease the risk of vole damage.
Okay, great. We did have another one asking if pre-emergent herbicides work over mulch or wood chips.
I was expecting it because I got it before. I can address that. I mean, I will answer right now, truthfully. So I had a question a few weeks ago regarding that. My recommendation is that if you plan to use both mulch on pre-emergent herbicide, get the pre-emergent herbicide before applying the mulch. Clearly, because the weeds are, the seed are in the soil. The pre-emergent herbicide, and I will be discussing that, is really working in the soil. So you need to get this herbicide in the soil for preventing the weeds to emerge. If you put a pre-emergent herbicide at the top of the mulch, if the seed, the herbicide will not be where it's supposed to be in the soil. And basically, the seed can emerge. If you don't have a sufficiently thick layer of mulch, the seeds can emerge. You may have put the herbicide, but the herbicide will not do anything to control, because when the seed have started emerging out of the ground, the pre-emergent herbicide usually will not be working. But that was a nice move for discussing. I mean, the next part of the presentation, which will be focusing on herbicide. Michael, are we good for going on herbicide?
All right, Thierry. So we had one question going back to part of what you were covering earlier about application of pre-emergent herbicides followed by an application of wood chips. And the question is really, should we take the time, between the application of that pre-emergence herbicide and the application of the wood chips to go ahead and irrigate before applying the wood chips?
Yes.
Does that make a difference there? Half inch to an inch, depending on the label? What would you recommend there?
Yes, no, that's a great question. Actually, I didn't mention it before, but definitely you need to get to space in time, the application on the wood chips application, because you need to get sufficient water to activate this herbicide. So you need to get at least, I would say usually the minimum, it depends on herbicide. So it's hard to say exactly how much water you need. I would say as a rule of thumb, getting 1 inch of water should be sufficient with most of the pre-emergence herbicide to get them moving into the soil. Only when you got this 1 inch of water as a rainfall or irrigation, you can start applying your mulch. Now, what I didn't mention is that some of these pre-emergence herbicides great for annual weeds, but if you have nutsedge can go through the plastic mulch, but it can also go easily through a pine bark mulch if you want. So even the mulch later may not, you may still have to use some post-emergence herbicide for targeting some specific weed, especially I have yellow nutsedge in mind, because I know that it's something that can easily grow to the pine bark mulch.
Okay, thank you, Thierry. We have a few more here. One is asking, what would you recommend for Japanese knotweed control?
Oh, that's a good one. Yes, I actually, yeah, it's not something, I've seen it here. Truthfully, Japanese knotweed, I know you need to use both pre-emergence and post-emergence herbicide. So something, it's an expensive weed control, but something to consider with Japanese knotweed is Cazaron, because Cazaron is a pre-emergence herbicide that is working decently well on perennial weed species. So that would be something to consider as a pre-emergence application. Probably you need to follow up with either 2,4-D application or glyphosate application to get a systemic application later in the season, because Cazaron can suppress Japanese knotweed growth, but ultimately you will still get some plant emerging later in the season. So, coming back with an effective systemic post-emergence herbicide is something to consider really for getting control of Japanese knotweed.
All right, thank you very much.
But
we had one.
Jerry, just not.
Yes.
The thing is that just do not rely solely on glyphosate or Roundup if you want. Try to consider using a pre-emergence herbicide as well for controlling Japanese knotweed.
Okay, got it. Thank you. There was a question about whether or not any adjuvants are recommended with Roundup or glyphosate.
Yes, actually, yes or no. If you're looking at the label is not telling you to use any adjuvant. In my experience, especially with weeds that are already well established, using ammonium sulfate, AMS, on my top of my head, I don't have the rate right here, but using ammonium sulfate may really help increasing the amount of Roundup absorbed by the plant. And the more Roundup is absorbed by the plant, that's something that will really help, killing the plant as well. So maybe not for if you're dealing with just annual weeds. Most of them, Roundup by itself without any adjuvant will just be enough for killing the weeds. Now, if you're dealing with perennial weed species, I know that here it's a different system, but in cranberry we are dealing a lot with red maple. The way we are controlling it is that we are whipping basically Roundup on the maple leaf, and I did some work using some AMS and some non-ionic surfactant, and we marginally improve red maple control by adding these either ammonium sulfate, AMS, as well as non-ionic surfactant. I would say that yes, for perennial weed species, using some of these surfactant may may improve control.
That's great information. Thank you, Thierry. You're a man in demand, I will tell you, because the questions keep coming in. And so if you're okay, we'll run through a couple of more here while we have time.
Yeah, I have time. I mean, it's just hope everyone can understand the French accent.
Okay. All right. Let's see.
Jeremy?
There was one here. What would you recommend for blue stem control in low bush wild blueberries? There's another follow-up that's related. Best herbicide choices in high organic matter situations, such as mulch blueberries. So I want to combine those two.
So blue stem, because that's the same. That's the same weed which is causing us a lot of trouble here in cranberry. Actually, we don't have a good solution. We don't have a good perennial. Well, I mean, in cranberry, we don't have a good solution. Now in blueberry, I know Curb. Curb is really the best herbicide we can have for pre-emergence control of perennial grasses. I know we have a label for high bush blueberry. I will have to look. I mean, that's something. If it's labeled on low bush blueberry, and I don't see why it shouldn't be labeled, and if it's labeled in your state, I really would like, I really would like to get people considering using Curb, fall application, eventually early spring application before it gets too warm, for getting some control of perennial blue stem. Now, later in the season, we did work with Select, we worked with Post. None of them are providing sufficient control of blue stem. So in our situation, we are, since blue stem is a perennial grasses, we have to use some weak application of Roundup for really cleaning, for really killing the blue stem. Because the graminicide, the grass herbicide post-emergence are not really working well on this one. So it's a combination of using Curb, if you can use it in your state as a pre-emergence herbicide, on probably killing whatever is emerged later in the season with glyphosate. And also very important, when it's emerging, if it's still at a low density, manual pulling of this, of this tuft of blue stem is also very important if it's already low infestation.
Okay. And then how about anything in particular where we're dealing with high organic matter situations in blueberry?
Yeah. Will, that's actually, I would like to have this problem here in New Jersey, because actually the problem is that our organic matter is mostly decreasing rather than increasing, and it's causing a bunch of other issues. The issue is that with the high organic matter content is that many of these herbicides, and especially when I was mentioning Curb initially, I would assume I would have to look at the molecule chemistry, but I would assume that these kind of herbicides are binding very well to organic matter. So you are in the kind of situation where you really need to use almost a maximum label rate to expect to get some effect. And if it's really too high, this pre-emergence herbicide will not really be working. So you will have to rely pretty much only on post-emergence herbicide if that's the case. But not knowing exactly what is the percentage of organic matter, it's difficult. But usually with high level of organic matter, you really need to use maximum label rate.
All right, and I think we have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think we just have one more here to get to. Someone's asking, oh, they're continuing to come in actually, but best weed control options for near the tree trunk where there's no mulch. So for instance, with and without plastic tree wraps.
The best herbicide option for, okay.
And obviously that will depend on the weeds that you're dealing with, but
yes.
I think maybe the question is getting at safety for the trees.
So is it pre-emergence or post-emergence herbicide?
They don't say, but I'm guessing post-emergence.
Huh. I would say post-emergence. I mean, probably the safest one is probably to use gramoxone. It's not the safest option for us as human, but it's probably the safest option for the plant. AIM is really you really need to get, small seedlings. I will be extremely careful. I mean, I would always be extremely careful with glyphosate, of course, but also with Rely. We have seen, in the past, there have been discussion on the fact that Rely can cause injury. That's true, but only if the plant have been very, under some kind of stress. So you're just adding herbicide as another layer of stress. So that's why Rely can cause a potential injury. I would say that really the safest option for the plant is really to use Gramoxone because it's only strictly a contact herbicide. And if you have a solid bark, if you don't have any green tissue, you will not cause injury because the herbicide will just be inactivated relatively quickly. Gramoxone is really working well on any kind of green tissue. So if it's not green, it should be fine.
Right. And actually, we have one more question. We'll really make this the last one. Would you recommend Princept and Devronol combo for high bush blueberries with wood chips?
No, I see the combo because that's you probably want to get broadleaf species on grass species at the same time. I like Devronol, but my concern with Devronol is that in my experience, especially in New Jersey, so maybe further south, it doesn't last very long. If you have 4 weeks of residual control with Devronol, that's the best you can get here in New Jersey. It's fading relatively quickly. So I think one better option would be to mix Princept on Solicam. Some things that I've been using very successfully in the past was a three-way mix, was using Princept plus Callisto, Mesotrione, that's for blueberry, because basically you have a synergistic interaction between the two herbicides, especially for post-emergence control. That works really well, that keeps the soil clean. On the third herbicide was Surflan. Unfortunately, this year, Surflan is not available. I don't know when it will be back. So for grass control, my recommendation would be to add Solicam to the mix to really get a solid. I think, yes, Princept plus Solicam plus eventually putting Mesotrione, Callisto to the mix or motif is making a great combo. At least if it's not too weedy, that should provide you really long residual control over the season.
Okay, and then the last thing I have here, Thierry, is just whether or not Rely, you would consider that a good alternative. I think that was the question is Rely a good alternative to Gramoxone?
Yeah, yes. If you can, Rely may be in short supply this year. Okay, so let's put that first. But Rely can be a good alternative, especially if you're dealing with weeds that are getting taller. So I did some work looking at Maristel, for example, which Maristel in New Jersey will not be controlled by glyphosate because our population is glyphosate resistant. So we need to use either Rely or Gramoxone. Gramoxone will work well if you still have the Maristel at the rosette stage, but once it starts bolting, when it starts forming this stem, we switch to Rely because that's really the best option. Now, my concern is that if you have any kind of green tissue, again, if you have any kind of green tissue with Rely, you may expect to get more injuries than what you will expect from Gramoxone. So just it's a good alternative. It's a better alternative if you didn't get the time to put your Gramoxone at the right time. But just be careful because the potential for crop injury is higher than what you will get with Gramoxone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Thierry. That's all we have for questions in the chat. Mike, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy. I did see one last one. I think you might have addressed it a little bit, Terry, but I want to just double check. Poison ivy near apple trunks. Which material would you recommend for, I'd imagine, a post-emergent?
Geez, that's a tough one because we have one herbicide which is working well on poison ivy. It's motif, but unfortunately it's not labeled on apple, so it's out of the picture. Okay. On this one, it's really glyphosate. Again, glyphosate is the best one for that. You may want to consider, and I know it's poison ivy, but if you can move the poison ivy manually away from the trunk. And we do that here in, for example, in blueberry, we have smilax, briar growing inside the blueberry bushes. And we have crew of people just removing that, laying out the vine into the raw middle, and then you can start spraying your glyphosate in the raw middle without causing injury to your plant. So the trick is, yes, use glyphosate, but make sure you can move away the vine from the trunk so you don't have any kind of injury.
I'd like to thank Thierry. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I'd like to thank the team on the NEFC group here, and I'd like to thank you all for attending today. Have a great week, and we'll see you next season. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.